And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, your host and purveyor at whiskeypolitics.net. You can find us at the Ricochet Audio Network, America's Voice Television News, and YouTube. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and the notifications so you're updated on all of our interviews. Also, you can find us on all of your favorite podcast applications, iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. You know, this episode is Thanksgiving week, and we wanted to take the time kind of step away from the political divide and talk less about the issues of the day. This week, I just wanted to say first and foremost how thankful I am for my family and friends and you, our viewers and listeners. Without you, we wouldn't be here doing what we do, bringing fascinating guests to you. Whether you're watching from home or listening in your car, we greatly appreciate it. And from both Melissa Praemonitus, our producer, and myself, we want to thank you. And our gift to you is something which I'm sure many of you will enjoy, and that is an inside look into what it was like working directly with President Ronald Reagan. And to hear some things even Ronnie's biggest fans may not know. Joining us today is Colonel Steve Chealander, who served as military aide to President Ronald Reagan from 1985 until the end of his term. Just a little biography. Starting in 1964, Mr. Chealander served in the U.S. Air Force with tours of duty in Vietnam and Spain, and he was an F-4 pilot, an instructor pilot, and then a U.S. aggressor pilot. Mr. Chealander was a member of the U.S. Air Force Air Demonstration Squadron, the Thunderbirds. He flew with the team until 1985 when he was assigned as a staff officer at the Tactical Air Command at Langley Air Force Base. And in 1986, Mr. Chealander was selected as military aide to President Ronald Reagan. Now, in that capacity, he performed a variety of ceremonial and emergency preparedness duties, which included custody of the president's emergency briefcase, the football. It took him from Washington, D.C. to West Coast, Rancho de Cielo, Ronald Reagan's ranch, Camp David, and of course around the world doing some of the most pivotal and historic moments in modern history. I had the honor to briefly meet with Colonel Chealander at the Ronald Reagan Library last month, and I knew his stories, listening to him, would be greatly appreciated by our audience. And for those listening on Ricochet, the Colonel was with the President doing the Berlin Wall speech. I think it was June the 12th, 1987, the day of the Tear Down This Wall speech, written by Reagan speechwriter and Ricochet co-founder Peter Robinson. So in his tenure working with President Reagan, Colonel Chealander spent some private moments with President Reagan and graciously accepted our invitation to come on and discuss with them. So sit back. I know I will. I'm going to be drinking from my Ronald Reagan mug today and enjoy the Whiskey Politics interview with Colonel Chealander. Colonel, welcome. How are you today?
I'm good, and thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction.
My pleasure. First and foremost, most of us know the nuclear football from the movies, but can you explain exactly what that is?
Good question. I get that a lot, and of course, it's a highly classified part of what we did with the president, what the president still does today. But suffice to say, it's the connectivity of the president to the Defense Department and the United States military, which makes him commander-in-chief, and it's for the eventuality of nuclear conflict.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So from what I understand, I mean, you were very close as a military aide. Exactly what does that role require?
It's several fold. First and foremost, it's carry the football. I mean, that's the primary reason that the military aide is there. There's 5 military aides, one from each military service, which includes the Coast Guard. And there's a military aide with the president within arm's length 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, regardless of where the president is in the world. And the duties of the military aide include, as you said, the football, which is part of the duties as emergency actions officer for the president. So not only do we carry the football and are well versed in the use of it, should it ever be needed, but we are to arrange all of the emergency actions for the president wherever he is in the world. And what I mean by that is the Secret Service protects the body of the president. The military is charged with the continuity of the presidency. In other words, we own all the assets that support the president. So you have one focal point, which is the military aid. We have Air Force One and all of the personnel assigned to Air Force One. You have Marine One, all the Marines assigned to that. Camp David is run by the military, the Marines, and the Navy particularly. The Communications Agency, White House Communications Agency, that's all military run. Even the cars that drive the executive branch officials to and from in Washington are all run by Army personnel. So owning all of those assets that support the president in emergency situations, the military aid is charged with using those assets as we travel around for emergency actions contingencies. We also, military aid acts as a ceremonial aid when necessary. So when you see the president troop on the line of foreign militaries or our own military, you'll usually see the military aid one step back and to the right of the president as you troop the line. And in some cases, we act as the personal aid. The president has a personal aid that helps keep him on time, carry the different papers and so forth, and make sure that the president has everything he needs, whatever he's doing at any given time. And sometimes the aid, military aid, takes those responsibilities because we are close to him sometimes when the personal aid is not. For instance, in President Reagan's situation, when we were at the ranch, the only two people that stayed up at the ranch from the staff were the military aide and the doctor, the president's doctor. Everybody else in the staff, including the personal aide, were down in Santa Barbara. And so anything that had to come up to the president that the personal aide would normally take to the president, the military aide did that. As a matter of fact, I've taken congressional bills that needed to be signed by the president. I've taken those to the president, sat with him while he signed them. They brief you on those, as they come up, so you can answer questions for the president. Basic questions. We can't get into the depth of it because we don't know that much, but we can talk to the president about it. We take him his personal briefing that he gets every day, his classified briefing that the president of the United States gets every morning. We would take that to him, sit with him while he went over it, and he would make notes sometimes in the margins. Very highly classified document, so it had to be controlled in that way. And then we would back brief the different agencies of the notes, questions, whatever the president had on those details. So a lot of different functions that the military aid carries out: emergency actions, ceremonial, personal aid. And it was quite taxing. We did an awful lot of work in that regard.
Wow. I bet it was. That's actually quite fascinating. And just a real quick question on all of that, because it sounds like you spent a lot of time with Ronald Reagan personally, one-on-one in many cases, and you had your finger on the pulse of the policies as well. So, you were seeing things from a macro level. Real quickly, going back to the nuclear football, I heard there's more than one nuclear football. Is that true?
There is there's a primary that goes with the president. There's a backup. You've got to always have a secondary in case something happens and you need.
Right.
And there's a backup that would go with the vice president or whoever is the successor. To give you an example of the extra football, during an inauguration or a State of the Union address, where everybody in the line of succession is in attendance at that meeting, they would always designate one successor that would be pulled out of that and would not go to that meeting, but would be flown to another location with one of the president's military aides and a backup football to be apart from that venue in case, God forbid, something ever happened and the line of succession was annihilated. Then you would have the one successor that was out in a football and could assume the presidency of the United States. I myself did that one time when I was at the White House. It was during a State of the Union address, and all the cabinet officials were all in the Congress, over at the Congress for that State of the Union. And I went with the Secretary of Agriculture. I took him and a football, and we got on a military aircraft and flew to Colorado Springs, watched the State of the Union address, and as soon as it was over, we got back on the airplane and came back to Washington. So yeah, obviously there is another football.
Yeah, that's. I mean, from a standpoint, we all know, the designated survivor rule, and you have to have that line of succession to the presidency. But when you're actually there in that moment, and you're with that person that, worst case scenario, he might end up becoming president. What thoughts are going through your head? I assume you just pretend, everything's going to be fine, right?
Well, for me, and for us that were in that position as military aide, that's our job.
Right.
We were military officers doing our job as military officers. And so, you don't really think of it in that perspective. You just do what you're supposed to do in that regard. On the other hand, the person that's the successor, the designated survivor, if you will, I remember having a conversation with him as we sat there with a 4-star Air Force general in Colorado Springs to watch this address. And he was telling me how eerie that was for him.
Yeah.
And saying, this is really eerie. He says, I knew this took place. He said, but me being the one and you sitting here and the football right there, he said, that it's a very eerie feeling. And he says, you realize the enormity of that responsibility. And so it affected him in that way. For me, I was doing my job as an emergency actions officer for this situation.
There's a television show that actually is now on Netflix. I caught a couple of episodes. It's called Designated Survivor with Keith Sutherland, the guy from 24. And that first episode, you see the Capitol building blowing up, and he becomes the designated survivor. He was really, down there on the rung. But so, yeah, I mean, you see this happening, and you, at the back of your mind, you have to think to yourself, well, I guess it's in the realm of possibility. But, well, I want to talk more about your experience working directly with President Reagan and some of the things that you saw on the front lines there in the White House. Right after this break, we'll be right back with Colonel Stephen Chealander. And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. And if you're not following us on YouTube, please click that subscribe button, and you can hear us on the Ricochet Audio Network as well. Here with Colonel Stephen Chealander, who served as military aide to President Reagan. And you spent a lot of time personally with the president. I understand you spent some time with him at his personal ranch as well, Rancho de Cielo?
Yes. And that's the nature of the position. It's you have to be there 24/7, as I said earlier. And so when he's at the ranch, when he's at Camp David, we're at Camp David. When he's traveling around the country, if he's staying or around the world, even if he's in a suite in a hotel room, one of the rooms in the suite is given to us, and we're right there in that suite so that we can be right next to the president should we be needed. When we stay in the White House, we stay they have a bedroom all set up for the military aide to spend the night in the White House, if that's where the president is during the week, and military aide is there during the night. Now, the ranch, that happened to be the place that President Reagan liked the most to go, and that's where he took his relaxing time, and he enjoyed very much being out there. Well, for us, that's where we went. And the president rode horses. We rode horses. The president cut wood and cleared brush and worked on his ranch like any rancher would do. We were right out there with him. And so, yes, I spent a lot of time in very close proximity. And one of the things that I always talk about is that was happening back then was President Reagan and I were a bit kindred spirits. We kind of saw things the same. I was a young military officer doing my job and doing the best I could, and didn't realize that a relationship was kind of forming with President Reagan. I mean, now we didn't become best friends. That's not my point. But my point was we saw an awful lot of things alike. He liked to tell jokes. He liked to talk with people, and I like to tell jokes. I like to talk with people. I like people, and so we got along. And But the personality of the president was amazing in this time that I spent with him in all these little different situations. The one you've alluded to already that was about, I call them my firsts, the first time I did things with the president. Now, most of the things you can do with one of the other military aides. They can train you and riding on Air Force One. Marine One was a little different. I'll get into that story if you want later. The first time I rode on Marine One, I had to do it by myself as I was briefed to do. The time at the ranch that you were alluding to, which is one of my favorite stories, I went out to the ranch my first trip, and I went out maybe 3 days early before the president was going to arrive. And I went out and I was doing all kinds of different exercises and drills with the Secret Service, riding the horses, and they would fire Uzi weapons and so forth, trying to spook the horses and see how they would react under these kind of pressure situations. They would have bad guys trying to kidnap the rider that was riding on the president's horse, that was playing the part of the president. A lot of different scenarios. So it was a lot of work for 2 days or so. And so now comes the time that the president's coming into the ranch. And I'm at the ranch. I'm there with the doctor. Actually, that's not true. The doctor came in with the president. I was already at the ranch waiting for him. One of the other military aides came in on a helicopter with the president. They got the little Jeep Cade down to the ranch house, and they got the president and Mrs. Reagan all settled in their house. And then the doctor came up to our little hooch up at above where the ranch house is, and came in, and I was there waiting for him. Now, these little hooches like that I was talking about, the Seabees, the Navy Seabees, built these prefabricated structures. They built 3 of them up there, put together 3 of them up there for use at the ranch. One of them was for the Secret Service command post. The other one was a place where the president could have a conference room where if he needed to have meetings up there, he could do that. He also gave his Saturday radio address from that building. And then right across from that was another little double wide, I call them, double wide trailer. And it was a little 2-bedroom place, not much, just a little prefabricated 2-bedroom place. That's where the doctor and the military aides spent the nights up at the ranch. And so here's the president now back. He just got to the ranch, and it's about 5 o'clock in the evening. And Dr. Hutton and myself were sitting in this little dining room in this hooch. And I'm sitting where I can see the door to the front door of it. And all of a sudden I look over, and there's the president standing at the door. And I told Dr. Hutton, I said, Dr. Hutton, the president's at the door. He says, well, go answer the door. So I went over and opened the door. And President Reagan standing there, and he had 2 bottles of wine in his hand. And he said, I said, Mr. President, I said, would you like to come in? He goes, no. He says, I just want to say welcome to Rancho de Cielo. He said, I know this is your first trip here, Steve, and I just want to welcome you aboard, and I hope you enjoy your stay here. And he says, I don't know what you're having for dinner tonight, so I brought red and I brought white. And he handed me 2 bottles of wine. I said, well, thank you, Mr. President. Would you like to come in and have a glass of wine? And he said, oh, no. He says, I just wanted to make sure that you were welcome and you enjoy the wine. And he turned and he left. And, so here's my first trip to the ranch, and this is my welcome that I've already gotten. Well, the next day was the first horseback ride. And we're going to go down to the tack barn, and you've got to go down. We go down about 9:30. The ride's going to start at 10:30. And you're responsible for your own horses, and you got to saddle them and bridle them and do all the things you have to do to get the horses ready to go on the ride. Well, then the ride goes off at 10:30, and we rode for about an hour and a half, and the president's out front leading the ride, and he takes you back in some pretty rough country. There's 688 acres on this ranch, and it's pretty rough country right at the top of this mountain. And came back from the ride, nice ride, and it was my first one. And so we're unsaddling our horses and taking all the tack off, and we're going to put it in this little room, which is the tack barn. And there's 6 pegs for saddles. It's a small little room, and it's pretty austere. It's not really a big. I always used to say it's not like Dallas. If you ever watch the TV show Dallas, you know, it's not like that ranch at all. It's pretty austere, and so you got this little room, 6 pegs for saddles and pegs for bridles just above it. So as I walk in there to put my saddle up on the peg, I realize that the president's in the room, and I see him over there. He just finishes locking up a little cabinet, and he puts the key in this little small stand, and in the drawer. And I realized, okay, it's just the 2 of us in this small room, and this would be a perfect opportunity for me to say thank you for the wine the night before. So I said, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much for that wine last night. That was excellent, and it was such a nice gesture. I appreciate it very much. And he says, oh, would you like some more? And I said, well, no, Mr. President, that's not why I said that, to try to get more wine. I just wanted to say thank you. That was very nice. And he says, well, I know. He says, but look at this. So he goes back over to that little drawer. He opens it up, gets the key out. And he goes back over to those little cabinets that he had just shut. And he opens up these cabinets, and there's cases of wine in this thing, sort of cases of wine. And he says, look at all this. He said, I get this from all over the state of California, you know. He said, wineries, vineyards. And he says, I'm not going to ever drink all this. He says, so help yourself if you want more, anytime. And so then he proceeds to keep talking about the wine and where he gets the wine. And he gets down on one knee, and he's pulling the wine out of these cabinets. He pulled one out, and he explained to me where that vineyard was, or who he knew at that winery, and how they named wine in California after the grape, and different regions in the grape. He was going through all of this. And I'm leaning over a hobby horse that's right there next to him. And a hobby horse, on top of the hobby horse, there's a saddle, and I'm kind of leaning on that saddle, and I'm just down on both elbows, and I'm in jeans. He's in his riding clothes, you know, and he's on one knee, and he's explaining all this to me, and it's dawning on me that, man, this is 2 guys. It's just 2 guys talking.
Yeah.
But look at who one of these guys is. This is the President of the United States, and this is my first time out at the ranch. And my nickname back when I was flying fighters, and still is today, is Jethro. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, this one thought. I said, Jethro, if they could just see you now.
Right.
And because it was so unbelievable where I was at that moment, and with this man. And that's when things started with me and President Reagan, is at that point, you know, because and I was asking him questions, and and he was asking me questions, and we were just talking, you know.
Just guys. Just happens to be the president.
Yeah,
you know,
that was who he was.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because you look at, that was the equivalent of Monticello or Mount Vernon, right? For Jefferson or Washington, right? That was his place. That was his solace, right?
Yes, and he loved it there.
Yeah. And, you know, we've all seen the pictures, and we're going to be posting some here through the interview of him working the ranch. That's where he really found peace. And, you know, you were in his inner sanctum. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of these conversations that you had with him, where you actually weren't just at the ranch, but you were around the world. So we'll be right back with more fascinating discussion here with Colonel Chealander. And welcome back, Whiskey Politics. Dave Sussman here, and I really do have the honor to be chatting with the military aide to President Ronald Reagan, Colonel Stephen Chealander. I understand that you did a lot of advance trips to Europe. You had the summits with Gorbachev. You had the Berlin Wall speech. What were those advance trips, and ultimately, you know, how did those end up working with President Ronald Reagan when you were, you know, traveling around you didn't go directly with him. You went a long time before, correct?
Yes. All the trips, when the president travels off the 18 acres of the White House grounds, he has the full entourage with him, Secret Service, military, all the military support and so forth, Secret Service in particular. And every time you travel, for instance, even like, and more importantly, when you travel to Europe, a good example of how this all works, and I'll lay it out as how the story worked, and then I'll get into the story that personally was part of my thing. And this is one of my favorite stories because it it talks about my father and what he did in his life. So we're going to go to the Economic Summit, which is the G7, and it's going to be in June of 1987. And in December of 1986, we start advancing that trip. And so we flew our first trip to Europe to advance the trip that's going to take place in 7 months. And we traveled to all the different stops. The stops were going to be in Venice, Italy, was where the Economic Summit was going to be. Halfway between, we're going to be there for 9 days. At the midway point, we were going to go over to Rome and go to the Vatican and meet with the Pope, and then come back to Venice and finish up the Economic Summit. And then from there, we're going to go up to Germany to Berlin. And the president's going to do two things. He's going to give a speech at the Berlin Wall, and he's going to come back to Tempelhof Airport, and he's going to celebrate the 750th birthday of Berlin. And then we're going to go from there on our way out to Bonn, Germany, and visit shortly with Chancellor Kohl, and then we're going to go on back to the United States. So we have to advance all those stops. And to give you an idea what an advanced team looks like, the Secret Service, of course, has their contingent of advanced agents. The White House Communications Agency has their agents, and they're all working for me. I'm kind of the focal point for all of those folks. We've got Air Force One people to see where how we're going to accommodate Air Force One. We have Marine One people with us. We have the White House Medical Unit with us. And so we've got this big team that's traveling, and then not to mention the White House advanced staff, which are all the ones that work in the White House and are setting up all of the policy issues and how they want the president portrayed and so forth during the visit. We all have our specific duties, whether it's emergency actions, whether it's Secret Service, whether it's medical unit, so forth. The medical unit, for instance, we always have to have, when the president travels, you always have to have a level 1 trauma center on alert wherever the president is, with communications in that trauma center in case you had to come to that location. So they put in White House communications in that trauma center so that you can communicate if you had to in an emergency situation. The Air Force One has to, where are you going to park it? Where are you going to get the fuel for it? How are you going to secure that fuel? Make sure that fuel is not contaminated. Lots of different things that got to go on. Same thing for the helicopters. Same thing for the vehicles, if you're going to have vehicles. So an aspect of this summit was pretty unique in that we're going to Venice, Italy, and you don't drive motorcades around Venice, Italy. You have to get where you're going by boat. So we have boats, the United States Navy. And so that's incumbent upon me to arrange the boats to transport the president and work with the Secret Service to make sure that they're the right kind of boats to transport the president for these 9 days that we're going to be in Venice. And so what I ended up doing in that case was contacting the Navy and telling the Navy I need admiral's barges, which are 40-foot launches that travel amongst the ships of a carrier task group, to and fro. So basically, the USS Nimitz had to give up their admiral's barges so that we could use them in Venice for 9 days. That really kind of hurts the carrier task group, but they were able to backfill them and so forth. I don't know how the Navy did that, but the Navy gave us the boats. And so just a little sidelight and another story of how that worked. So I'm thinking, okay, we got to get these boats. So I'm working with the Secret Service. Secret Service has got to armor the boats. They've got to make sure that they're protected and so forth. So we figure out how we're going to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this big Navy ship into Naples, Italy. and we're going to get these barges, and we're going to put these barges in this big Navy ship. It's a 600-foot ship, and they can drive these barges up inside. It's a tender that works on these on boats at sea. And so then we're going to set sail around the boot of Italy from Naples and come around the other side to Venice, drop those admiral's barges off. But on that trip around, the Secret Service will be working on them while they're on that ship and armoring them and getting them ready to serve the president. So I've got all this set up on the first trip I go over there. I've got this set up, and so I leave after, I can't even remember how many days we were on that trip, I think 10 or whatever. We ended up spending, taking 5 different trips to Europe from December to June for a total of 52 days to advance this trip. Well, having come home from this one trip, I was at a PTA meeting with my children at their school, and I'm sitting there and my pager goes off. And in those days, it wasn't pagers like today, and we didn't have cell phones and so forth. I had a big brick phone, which was about all we could, do in those days, technology-wise.
That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, and so my pager vibrates in this PTA meeting, and so I step outside, and it doesn't have a number on it or anything. I just know that that's the White House switchboard calling me. And so on my big phone, I call the switchboard, and I said, "This is Major Chealander." And they said, "Stand by for a call with Major Peterson." He was the Marine military aide, and he was over in Venice setting things up after I left. So we're still doing all this setup. And he says, "Steve, where did you tell this Navy captain to park this big ship?" And I said, "Well, it's part of the standing plan. I mean, he's supposed to park it in the back bay of Venice and offload those barges, those launches." And I said, and we did that so that it'd be unobtrusive. And this is the G7. And we don't want the United States to come driving downtown Venice, Italy with a great big United States ship and announce our presence when you got other countries that are doing the same thing. And so we wanted to be in the back. And the guy says, Pete says, "Well, this guy drove it right downtown." And he says, "It's parked right next to Plaza Ducale, which is the main plaza in Venice, Italy, and it's parked right there at the pier." And I said, "Okay, I got it." And so I got off the phone, I called back to the switchboard, and I said, "I need the Navy flag officer at the Pentagon." And the Pentagon, when it's after duty hours at the Pentagon, you have a flag officer, which is a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star admiral or general, that's the duty officer while the Pentagon is after duty hours. And so it just so happens this night, it was a 2-star Navy admiral, which is perfect because I'm going to be talking about the Navy. And so here I am, a major in the Air Force, and I've got a 2-star admiral on the phone now. And I said, "Admiral, this is Major Chealander." And I said, "We have an op going on in Venice, Italy, where we're using Navy boats." And so he said, "I'm aware of the op." And I said, "Well, you might also be aware that we asked that major ship, that big the USS Whidbey Island, the big ship that came in there, we asked that it be parked in the back bay. Well, it's parked in the front." And I mean, that's kind of basic terminology, but it's parked in the front door,
Right.
He says, and the admiral says, "I got it, Major, thank you." And we hung up. And about 10 minutes later, I get another call back from Major Peterson that's in Venice, and he says, "Wow," he says, "who'd you talk to?" I said, "I talked to the flag at the Pentagon." And I said, "Why? What are you looking at?" And he said, "This guy is backing this boat up as we speak." And so that's the magnitude of what we did when we were setting these trips up. And we always tried to take into consideration what we were doing. That ship can't be there. That makes too big a signature of the United States. And we're just one of 7 nations. And so let's go put it where it was supposed to be. So that's part of the advance that takes place on these trips. While we continue on the advances, and I end up in Berlin on one of the advances. And the assistant to the president that's on the trip says, this is what we would like to see the president do when he's here for the birthday celebration. We would like him to meet some people that were instrumental in the history of Berlin, like the Bundesfrau that cleaned up Berlin one brick at a time after the war, the ladies that went out there and cleaned Berlin up and tried to return Berlin to its stately state. And and also some of the wall patrol guys, the guys that worked at Checkpoint Charlie and did that over the years, some wall patrol guys. And this guy, the assistant to the president, said we'd also like the president to meet some Berlin airlift pilots, because that's pretty significant in the history of Berlin. And so when I heard that, my ears kind of perked up. I'm sitting at the table, and I said, I turned to him, I said, hey, by the way, Ed, my father flew in the Berlin airlift. And he says, really? He said, man, this would be great. You know, what an optic that would be if your dad could be one of those Berlin, would your parents like to come? And I said, yeah. He said, okay, contact them, and we'll get the State Department to fly them over here, and they can be part of that ceremony. So all of that takes place, and then the rest of the advance continues on and continues on, and I've got my parents all set up to go. And now fast forward to the trip, because I think I've answered your question now on advance and so forth as to how all that takes place. So here we are on the trip, and this is the personal side of things for me. I flew out of Venice on Air Force One with President Reagan, and we came into Berlin. And when we landed at Tempelhof and I got off the airplane, I saw my parents kind of standing off in the distance. And so we got off Air Force One, the president said hi to some folks, and then he got in a motorcade and drove down to the Reichstag, down to the Brandenburg Gate, and where he gave this speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Following that speech, he came back to Tempelhof, we motorcaded back, came back into Tempelhof, and then the president started walking down through these different groups that he was going to meet that were instrumental in the history of Berlin. For instance, the Bundesfrau, the Checkpoint Charlie, Wall Patrol guys, and so forth. And then he got to the airlift pilots, and there were three of them, and one of those was my dad. So he commences to talk to these guys, one of which was Colonel Gale Halverson. Gale Halverson was known as the Candy Bomber. He came up with the idea during the Berlin airlift to drop candy as they flew into Berlin, dropped candy out for the children who were behind the blockade. And so it became a big deal.
Hearts and minds.
They got handkerchiefs, and all the wives, my mother included, my mother did this too. She would tie handkerchiefs to Hershey bars. And my dad would always, when he'd go out and fly a mission, he'd always have a box of the candy, and the crew in the back would dump them just as they came in to Tempelhof. They'd dump all these little parachutes out to the children that were behind the blockade. So Colonel Halverson, who came up with that idea and became known as the Candy Bomber, he was there as well, standing next to my dad. And so President Reagan met these three airlift pilots. And then from there, after he met my dad standing outside, we went into a holding room. A holding room is where the president always goes before he comes on stage. And in that holding room were my mother and father, President and Mrs. Reagan, and me. And we had photographers and so forth. And so they had a chance to have a private conversation before he's going to go on stage and make another speech. And so, and I've got pictures of all of that, you know, my dad and us with the president in the holding room. So then he goes on stage, and there's about 3,000 people in this big terminal building. And President Reagan goes on stage and makes this speech about the 750th birthday of Berlin. In that speech, he's referencing the people he just met outside that were instrumental in the history of Berlin. And then I met three Berlin airlift pilots. And he talks about Captain Bennett, who was a civilian pilot that had flown in the airlift. He talked about Colonel Gale Halverson and about how he was known as the Candy Bomber. And then he talked about my dad. And he said, and he had a full page of his speech about my dad and Colonel Alan Chealander, and talked about how my father was home from the war, was back in the States, and was recalled to come back and fly in the airlift, and how he never hesitated, and we had a job to do, we could do it. It was really touching what he was saying. And he said he, his wife, and infant son went back over to fly for the airlift. And he says, I'm proud to say that that infant son is today my military aide, and both he and Colonel Chealander are here with us today. So it was a very touching speech, and it caught me off guard because I didn't know it was in the speech. So he finishes up. We get back on Air Force One. I say goodbye to my parents. We get on Air Force One. We fly to Bonn. We spend 2 hours with Chancellor Kohl. Then we get back on Air Force One. We're flying back to the United States. And usually the president comes back, you know, but it was a long day and he was tired. And so we didn't see him very much on Air Force One. So we land at Andrews. It's late at night. We get off Air Force One. We get on Marine One, and we start heading for the White House. As we're traveling over, President taps me on the knee, and he says, Steve, where are your parents tonight? And I said, well, they're still back in Berlin, and they're coming home tomorrow on the C-5 that's going to bring your helicopters back. And he said, and he starts into a conversation at that point. I mean, actually, he's the one talking. I'm not talking. About how much that meant to him to meet my father, and what men and women like my father and mother mean to our country, and meant to our country. Talking about the military, talking about the sacrifices, talking about World War II, talking about the Berlin airlift and what that was, and how it lasted 11 months until the Soviets caved, and it opened up the blockade. But we were of the mind that we will continue doing this until you do. And he said, and men like your father, were the ones that did that. And he said, we don't pay enough attention to that in our society. But it was a touching state, discussion, and which is typical of the way President Reagan was. But he says at the end of that, he says, I wish there was more I could do for your dad. And I said, Mr. President, what you just did was fantastic, and I said, the speech and, holding room and meeting my dad. He says, well, I know. He says, but I just wish there was more I could do. He says, tomorrow when they come back on the C-5, you think they could come by and see me one more time at the White House and we could visit at the Oval Office? I said, yes, sir, I can do that. He says, but one more thing. And he reaches in his pocket of his coat and he pulls out the speech cards that he used to make that speech about the Berlin celebration of the 750th birthday. And he said, I'm supposed to turn these into the National Archives, but I don't think they're going to miss them. And he sets them down on his table, he signs them, and he hands them to me, and he says, give these to your father. And one of the most touching moments I ever had. And again, it's one of those things, we're on Marine One. Nobody would ever know of that, And that's one of the reasons that I speak like I speak. It's all the different organizations that I've spoken to over the years. I do that to show him. And what you saw was when he gave an inaugural address or the State of the Union or a speech from the Oval Office or whatever it was. The sincerity that he had exuded in those speeches, that's who he really was. And I've seen him on the inside. And I've seen him when he first awakens in the morning and he's still in bed. I've had to talk to him and so forth. He's still the same guy. He always has time for you. He always has time for people. He loved people, very kind to all. One of the things he used to say was, it doesn't matter if it's the person that empties the trash in your office or if it's the head of state of the Soviet Union. They're the same. They're human beings, and they deserve the same dignity and respect. And that's the way he lived his life. And I'll tell you, it changed who I was when I left the White House. It changed who I was because of the way he was. But that Berlin story and those speech cards, that's one of my favorites because that really shows President Ronald Reagan. So,
How did your father respond to that when you showed him those cards?
oh, he was blown away. He was blown away. And we did come back to the White House after they got back on the C-5. We came back. They stayed with us for a couple of days there in Washington, and then I took him back to the White House, saw the president again, and but no, he was honored, as I was.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine.
You know, it's an honor to have been in this man's presence.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're going to come back one more section here. I want to get into Air Force One and chat just a little bit more about some of the legacy that Colonel Chealander. Is it Colonel, Major? How are you addressed?
They call me Colonel. That's I retired as.
Yeah.
I was there. I
Okay.
was a major. You know, then I was an airline captain. A long time ago, when I first started out, I was a sergeant. So,
Yeah.
you know, then I was on the NTSB, so I was the honorable. So if you call me Steve, I'm happy.
Just don't call you late for dinner, right?
There you go.
Okay, we'll be right back with the last segment here with Colonel Steve Chealander. And welcome back. Dave Sussman with you. Whiskey Politics at the Ricochet Audio Network, America's Voice Television Network, and YouTube, and all of your favorite podcast applications. Here with Colonel Steve Chealander, military aide to Ronald Reagan. And, you know, I'm a huge fan of the Reagan Library. It's where we met. I've seen many speakers there over the years. I got to tell you, everybody was on the edge of their seat listening to you. I've seen great speakers before, but everybody just wants more information from you. You know, but if you, a lot of people don't realize this. If you go on tour of the Ronald Reagan Library, the Air Force One that President Reagan flew on, as well as yourself, is there in the Air Force One pavilion. If you walk through the airplane now, there is a mannequin that dons the name Colonel Chealander. That's you, right? That's your uniform. That's
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, in 2003, I got a call from Joanne Drake. You may have met her. She's the one that sets up all this stuff at the library. She works at the library. She was on the advance office, and we were together at the White House. She worked in the, like I said, I was telling you about the advance office. She worked in the advance office, and I was military aide. And when they left office, and the president was in Century City and had an office there, Joanne was the chief of staff to the president. And she stayed that way until they built the library. And then once they built the library, there were offices out there and the private quarters upstairs. And the president would work out there. Well, Joanne.
Which, by the way, don't mean to interject. I just got a tour that night that I met you of their private. I haven't seen that before. It's fascinating. All the furniture, everything's laid out exactly the same. It's beautiful up there.
Yeah,
incredible.
And that's not open to the public.
Right. I was very lucky, very fortunate to get that.
And but it is where they worked and where they. I've attended several events up there, and I mean, I had lunch up there with Condoleezza Rice one time.
Wow.
And it's a nice place. But at any rate, Joanne came out, and she's still there, has an office, and she kind of runs things at the Reagan Library. And she's a good friend, a very good friend, a wonderful person, great human being, and loved the president just like I did. And so we've worked together over a lot of these years. 2003, she calls me and says, Steve, we understand that the Air Force is going to decommission tail number 27,000, which is the 707 that acted as Air Force One. And we want to get it for the library. And so we need your help. So all your contacts and everybody that you know, please do whatever you can do, and we'll work on our end, and we'll see if we can get this thing from the Air Force. Because everybody wanted that airplane. The Air Force Museum wanted it, and a lot of other museums wanted it as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Boone Pickens financed that, right?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll get to that. So we get the airplane. The Air Force says, okay, the Reagan Foundation, the Reagan Library can have it. So come the day that it's going to fly its last flight. So Joanne calls me again and says, hey, it's going to fly into Old Norton Air Force Base out in San Bernardino. And we want you there. Mrs. Reagan's going to be there. Everybody's going to be there. So I said, okay, I'll be there. So I show up, and here comes Air Force One, 27,000, flies in, makes a low pass, and pulls up, comes in and lands, and that was its last flight. They're now going to take it apart, put it on a trailer, and truck it up to the library. Well, at this event, Joanne standing next to me, she goes, Steve, you think we could get your uniform that you wore while you were aide to the president? You think we could get that for the library? And I said, well, sure. And she said, we don't know what we want to do with it or how we're going to take care of it. I mean, display it, but someday we may display it. And I said, okay. So I sent them my uniform. They sent me a receipt, National Archives receipt, so it's on receipt, on loan to the library. So now the airplane's up at the library, and it sits there for about 2.5 years. And there's a good book at the library bookstore. I don't know if you've seen it, but it talks about the restoration of Air Force One, and it talks about how it sat out back and it, waited because they had to build the pavilion to put it in, and they had to raise the money to do that. Well, they raised, I think, don't quote me on the figures, but I think it was somewhere around 28 million, and they needed 38 million to put this thing together. Well, Boone Pickens, T. Boone Pickens, stepped in and said, $10 million, gave it to the library, said, build the pavilion. And so they had enough money, they built a pavilion, and they built it around where Air Force One was going to be. Well, they bring Air Force One in. They've got all the engineers and everybody to put it in the position that it's going to be in. And it's on 3 pedestals. Main gear on 2, the nose wheels on 2. It's canted 2 degrees nose up, and it has like the air conditioning system is constantly running inside, so it sounds like when you're on board, it sounds like it's flying.
Yes, it does.
And it's kind of in the mode 2 degrees nose up. So we put it all together. They put it all together and got it all done, and it was finally ready for, in 2005, the grand opening of the Air Force One exhibit. So Joanne calls me again and says, Steve, we want you to come. We want you to speak to a couple of the groups of donors and so forth. You'll speak with Governor Pete Wilson, and you guys will kind of tag team a speech and so forth, and participate in this thing. We're getting President George W. Bush and his wife are going to come, and they're going to cut the ribbon with Mrs. Reagan. They asked me, can you get the Air Force Thunderbirds to fly over the opening of this thing? And so I did. And so I've got the Thunderbirds, and I'm doing all this, and I'm there about 2 days before the grand opening. And so, and Air Force One's sitting there in all its beauty and shields. And so I'm still working with some folks to make sure that everything on the airplane is in its authentic location. Oxygen masks are hung where they were supposed to be. The football is sitting somewhere where it's supposed to be when you came.
It's the first thing you notice after you walk in.
Yeah.
To the right there, yeah.
Yeah, and so we're putting it all together, making sure everything's legit. And Joanne is asking me to take groups of donors and people that are arriving for the ceremony through the airplane and give tours. At the same time, we're doing all this other stuff. So I do. I start taking different groups through, and she'll call me every now and then and say, hey, here's another group. Well, could you take them through? Sure, I'll take them through. And so come the night before the event, and she says, there's one more group that's the Presidential Honor Guard that are here for President Bush tomorrow. Will you take this honor guard through the plane? And this is late in the afternoon of the night before the event. So I take this honor guard through, and I work my way back. And as I get to the senior staff cabin, there it sits. And I hadn't seen it on all these other tours or any of the other stuff I was doing. Now there sits this mannequin, and it's got my uniform on it. And I was speechless. It stopped me in my tracks, and because I said, my gosh, and I say this all the time, I've been paid in my life no higher honor than that. Still today, I say that's the highest honor I've ever received. is being enshrined in Air Force One. It's still there today.
Yes, it is.
13 years later. And so I'm standing there, and I didn't realize, but there were several other people that were joining the tour with the honor guard on board the airplane because they knew that I'd been set up for this moment. And there were people that I had known back in the advance office that worked with Joanne. One in particular, her name was Kim O'Brien. And Kim was, she's a little flamboyant, you know, just a sweet person, but very, you'll understand why here in just a second. So we're standing there, and I can't think of the words to say. You know, it really caught me off guard. And all I said was, "Wow, and look at that, it has hair." You know, and Kim O'Brien standing in the back, she goes, "Yeah, but it's Sam Donaldson's hair." And I mean, just broke the moment up, and it was great. And so that's a favorite story now of the docents at the library when they're showing people, and people talk about, you know, some people come through every now and then, they know who I was or know me, and then they'll get to talking about me, and that story is told quite a bit about Sam Donaldson's hair. But that was the first time that my uniform ended up on Air Force One, and that's how it got there.
You know, one of the most remarkable things when you walk on Air Force One, and I've been on it more times than I can remember now, is how, you know, you think of Air Force One as this huge beast of an airplane that Obama and Trump fly on today. It's relatively a small plane, isn't it?
It is. Compared to the 747 of today, it is a smaller airplane. It served the purpose for us. You know, they had...
But what, 5 presidents flew on that?
7.
7 presidents. Wow.
And
wow, that's fascinating. So you go on there, you could see where you was sitting. You go to the back where the press were sitting.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little galley. You know, obviously the first lady had her little space, and where the president worked. And it's definitely worthwhile seeing. So yeah. It's quite fascinating. Well, you know, this is one of those things where, you know, you've got so many stories and so much experience. I mean, working directly and closely with Ronald Reagan, and, you know, ultimately becoming a friend. I mean, just to finish up here real quickly, because, you know, I feel like there's just so much history. I don't want to end the interview here. After he left the White House, did you stay in touch?
Yes. Yes, I did. As a matter of fact, from time to time, I'd get calls and contacted by different groups, and they'd say, "Hey, we're having a convention, and we would like to open it with a letter from President Reagan. Can you help us out?" And so I would go to Century City, and I'd see the president, and I'd get these letters and so forth. So from time to time, I saw him. And as a matter of fact, about I got out of the Air Force in 1991, and I moved to Bakersfield, California, where I was flying for American Airlines out of Los Angeles. And so I am in Bakersfield, and Bakersfield has this big business conference every year. And I mean, it's huge. And the speakers that they get, they've had Margaret Thatcher, they've had Gorbachev, big speakers. Well, this one year, I'm guessing, I think it was 92, somewhere in that area, they had Ronald Reagan. They got Ronald Reagan to come to that speech. Well, I got a call from Joanne, and she said, the president, as you know, is coming to Bakersfield to do the business conference, and he knows you're up there and wonders if we can visit while he's there. And I said, sure. And so I got my kids out of school and so forth. And when they got there, we went to it was at the Stockdale Country Club, and they had a big holding room that they had the president in when he got there. And so we showed up, and we came to that room, and there were a lot of people in there. And Joanne said, ladies and gentlemen, could we ask you maybe to wait outside so we can bring the Chealanders in and have a moment with the president? So we got a private moment with the president there. I think it was 92. I'd have to research it. Don't hold me to that. But we had a really nice time, took a lot of pictures, and rekindled the friendship of, you know, my kids. They had met the president several times, and so here now they get to see him again from a bigger kid standpoint. And but yeah, that was I did have an opportunity to see him quite a bit. And I'll just say one more time, or about seeing the president. You didn't ask me this, but I'll just say I was going to go see him later on in his struggle with Alzheimer's. And so I called down to Joanne and said, I'd like to come down and see the president. She said, well, talk to John Barletta. John Barletta was the head of the Secret Service detail for the president and a good friend of mine. John Barletta was the big horseback riding Secret Service agent, became real good friends with President Reagan. Barletta, I'll plug his book. He passed away about 6 months ago, Barletta did. But he had a book out called Riding with Reagan by John Barletta. And it's a very good book to read, so I'll just throw that out at you.
Okay.
But so I talked to John Barletta, and I said, John, I want to come up and see the president. And he said, Steve? He said, I don't want to tell you what to do. He says, but I want to give you some advice. He said, the president's not who you remember. He is from a physical stature standpoint, but he's not where you remember him. And he says, if I were you, I would remember him the way you remember him and not come up here and remember him the way you see him now. And I took his advice, and I did not go up there. And that was, so the last time I saw him was well before that. And I'm happy that I did, because I still remember the president as the president and Ronald Reagan the way I did.
When you leave the Reagan Library, for those that haven't been there, his handwritten letter letting the world know that he had Alzheimer's is one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen. And I was, just as a quick anecdote for our listeners, I was in D.C. When they had him at the house. I think it was at Congress, and I walked around and got a little card and paid my respects, and flew back to Southern California the same day that his body was flown back to Southern California to be placed in at the Reagan Library. And then I got to go to the Reagan Library and walk around there as well. So I'm a huge fan of the president. I was in high school and college during his presidency, so my formative years. He changed the world. And those people that supported and worked with him, like yourself, were part of that. And it was a pivotal point in American and world history, the end of the Cold War and much else. And so I want to thank you for your service. And last week was Veterans Day, and greatly appreciate everything that you've given our country. Thank you so much.
I thank you for those comments, and I'm honored to have served. And I'm honored to have served President Reagan.
Thank you. Where can folks find more information about you? I know you have a website.
I do have a website. It's stevechealander.com. Okay. I also, I won't pass out my email address and so forth.
Okay. Now, people can contact you through the website.
They can contact me through the website, stevechealander.com.
Very good. Thank you so much for taking the time. And again, thank you for your service. And this was just enjoyable. So I wish you a very happy Thanksgiving and upcoming holidays to you and your family.
Well, happy Thanksgiving to you too, Dave. I appreciate this very much. I was happy to do this, honored to do it.
Likewise. Thank you. And hopefully next time you come back to the Reagan Library, I'll make sure I come by and say hello again.
Okay. Well, I may be there soon, so maybe I'll see you then.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Colonel Chealander. And folks, don't forget to continue to follow us at Whiskey Politics. You can reach me at David Sussman on Twitter and whiskeypolitics.net. And don't forget to hit that click, subscribe, and follow button on YouTube, ricochet.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and give us that 5-star rating if you're enjoying the episode on iTunes. Again, special thanks to Colonel Chealander, and we'll be back again very soon at Whiskey Politics.